Every year, people drive down from St. Louis to a small town in southeast Missouri to go scuba diving. They come for the flooded lead mine underneath it, a billion gallons of clear water in a hand cut cavern, one of the strangest dive sites on Earth. We've told that story on this channel. The town is called Bonne Terre, 6,900 people, a main street you could walk in 10 minutes. And in a separate fenced section on the edge of that same small city, a place most of the divers will never see and probably never think about, is the room where the state of Missouri carries out its executions. Missouri has put 102 people to death since 1989. 40 of them died in Bonne Terre. And in July of 2026, the Marshall Project published an analysis of every death sentence handed down in America between 1972 and 2025, using data compiled by University of North Carolina professor Frank Baumgartner and the Death Penalty Information Center. It found something that surprises almost everyone who hears it. Nationally, about 18% of death sentences end in an execution. The overwhelming majority are overturned, commuted, or the person dies of something else first. In Missouri, it's more than half. Among states that have sentenced at least 10 people to death, only Virginia has a higher rate, and Virginia abolished the death penalty in 2021. So how did a played-out lead mining town of 7,000 people become the place where one of the most active death penalty states in the country does this? The answer runs through 150 years of the state trying to move this out of sight. Let's start with where it used to happen. For most of Missouri's history, executions were a county matter, and they were public. Hangings. The state used them until 1936. Then, in September of 1937, Governor Lloyd Crow Stark signed a bill replacing the rope with lethal gas, and the work moved indoors to a chamber at the Missouri State Penitentiary in Jefferson City. 40 people died in that room. The last one was in 1965. And then, for 24 years, Missouri didn't execute anyone at all. When the state was finally ready to start again, it had a problem. In 1988, the legislature had approved lethal injection as the method, but the building was the same building. So on January 6, 1989, when Missouri executed George Mercer, it did it inside the old gas chamber. They had looked at using the gas. They couldn't. The seals and gaskets that were supposed to keep the fatal gas from leaking out into the rest of the prison had rotted, and replacing them would have cost money. So they pulled the 2 metal chairs out of the chamber and brought in a gurney instead. That is how the modern era of executions in Missouri began, in a repurposed room because the old equipment had gone bad. That same year, the state moved death row to a new maximum security prison at Potosi in Washington County, and executions went with it. For the next 16 years, Potosi was where it happened. And then, in April of 2005, the Department of Corrections moved the execution chamber again, about 25 miles east, to a prison that had opened just 2 years earlier in Bonne Terre. The Eastern Reception, Diagnostic, and Correctional Center, 2,600 beds, the intake point for every man sentenced by a court in eastern Missouri. Here's the reason they gave for the move, and it is worth sitting with: staffing and morale. The problem at Potosi was that the officers who carried out the executions were the same officers who had guarded those men for years. They knew them. They walked past their cells every day, and then they were asked to do this, and then they came back to work the next morning. So the state separated the two. Missouri's death row stayed at Potosi. The chamber went to Bonne Terre. And now, when a man's date comes, he is driven from one to the other in the last days of his life, away from the officers who knew him to a building where nobody does. The first execution at the new facility was Donald Jones on the 27th of April, 2005. But here's the part almost nobody knows, and it's the reason Missouri didn't execute anyone for a stretch of the years that followed. For 11 years, from 1995 to 2006, the state's executions were overseen by a surgeon named Dr. Alan Dorhoff. In 2006, a death row prisoner named Michael Taylor challenged Missouri's lethal injection protocol in federal court. The case is Taylor versus Crawford, and one of the named defendants was the superintendent of the prison at Bonne Terre. What came out in that litigation was not an argument about ethics. It was an inventory of basic failures. The court found that Missouri had no written protocol specifying which chemicals were used or in what doses, that the procedure wasn't administered consistently, that the doctor mixing the drugs had dyslexia and had told the court that he sometimes confused the dosages because of it and appeared untroubled by that, and that during the executions themselves, his view of the prisoner was partially blocked, so he could not reliably tell how deeply anesthetized the man was. Missouri had been executing people for 17 years without writing down what it was doing. 2 years later, in 2008, an investigative reporter at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch named Jeremy Kohler identified Dorhoff publicly and reported that he had been sued for malpractice more than 20 times. And the state's response tells you what it had learned. The Missouri legislature passed a statute making the identities of members of the execution team confidential. That law is still in effect today. The doctor was gone. The secrecy was permanent. That whole history is laid out in a 2025 book by Karina Barrett Lane, a law professor at the University of Richmond, called Secrets of the Killing State. Her account of Missouri is not a story about cruelty. It's a story about improvisation. A state performing the most irreversible act it is capable of, and doing it with no manual. Executions resumed in Bonne Terre in November of 2013, with the serial killer Joseph Paul Franklin using a single drug, pentobarbital, bought from a compounding pharmacy. And in the decades since, this small building has hosted some of the most contested executions in the country. But one of them didn't just make news, it changed the law for the entire country. Russell Bucklew was sentenced to death for a murder committed in 1996. He also had a rare congenital disease called cavernous hemangioma, which grows clumps of blood vessels, unstable blood-filled tumors through a person's head, neck, and throat. His lawyers did not argue that Missouri couldn't execute him. They argued something narrower, that this particular method used on this particular man carried a serious risk that the tumors in his throat would rupture and that he would choke on his own blood before the drug took effect. They asked the state to use nitrogen gas instead. On April 1st, 2019, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled against him 5-4. Writing for the majority, Justice Neil Gorsuch held that the Eighth Amendment does not demand the avoidance of all risk of pain in an execution, and that a prisoner who challenges a method has to do more than object to it. He has to identify an alternative that is available and prove it would significantly reduce his suffering. Bucklew, the court said, hadn't done that. The case is called Bucklew versus Precythe. Precythe is Ann Precythe, at the time the director of the Missouri Department of Corrections. So the standard that now governs how every death row prisoner in America is allowed to challenge the way a state intends to kill them is a case named for a Missouri official argued over a chamber in Bonne Terre. Russell Bucklew was executed there on October 1st, 2019. In January 2023, Amber McLaughlin was executed here, the first openly transgender woman put to death in the United States. In April of 2024, Brian Dorsey was executed for the murder of his cousin and her husband. Before his date, more than 150 people asked the governor for mercy, including a former Missouri Supreme Court judge, several of the jurors who sentenced him, a bipartisan group of state lawmakers, and relatives of the two people he killed, and 72 corrections officers. These were the men and women who had supervised Dorsey for 17 years, and their letter opened by saying that, generally, they believed in capital punishment. They just didn't believe in this one. Governor Mike Parson said no. 5 months later, in September of 2024, Missouri executed Marcellus Williams for the 1998 murder of Felicia Gale, a social worker and former Post-Dispatch reporter. By then, the prosecuting attorney, whose own office had won the conviction, had filed a motion to throw it out. Testing had shown that the murder weapon was handled without gloves before the 2001 trial, and the DNA on the knife belonged to the assistant prosecutor who tried the case. The victim's family did not want the execution to go forward. The state attorney general fought to stop the evidentiary hearing. The Supreme Court declined to intervene twice. The most recent execution at Bonne Terre was in October of 2025. And as of this year, the number of people left under a death sentence in Missouri is 8. But this isn't a history lesson. It's an open question, right now. Because Missouri has a rule that most Americans assume doesn't exist. If a jury convicts a man of first-degree murder and then deadlocks on whether he should die, if they cannot agree, the judge is allowed to decide for them and impose death. Since that took effect in 1984, at least 18 people in Missouri have been sentenced to die by a judge rather than a jury. 4 of them have been executed. 11 of the 18 have since had their sentences reduced to life. In March of 2026, the Missouri House voted to end the practice, 140-7, with 95 Republicans in favor. It cleared a Senate committee unanimously. Then a single senator blocked it. That same month, a House committee held a hearing on abolishing Missouri's death penalty outright, the first such hearing in years. The bill was filed by a Republican. Among those who testified for it were the Archbishop of St. Louis and a woman who used to work at Potosi. Here's the thing about Bonne Terre that I keep coming back to. This town has always been the place where the difficult work happens out of sight. For 100 years, the thing that kept it alive was a mine. Men going down a shaft before sunrise to cut lead out of the rock underneath their own houses so that the rest of the country could have paint and pipe and batteries and never once think about where it came from. The mine closed in 1962. 41 years later, in February of 2003, the state opened a prison on 213 acres at the edge of town, and it was projected to bring more than 600 jobs to a county that badly needed them. That's the promise every prison town gets, and it's worth saying plainly that researchers who study this have generally found the promise oversold. That rural prisons tend not to produce the wider economic lift they're pitched on, partly because a lot of the jobs end up filled by people who commute in from somewhere else and spend their paychecks there. But some of them are local, some of them always were. And so the arrangement holds. Somebody in Bonne Terre still goes to work and does the thing the rest of the state has decided it wants done and would rather not watch. The divers come and go. The water in the mine stays perfectly clear. Bonne Terre. It's French. It means good earth.